Ethics Untangled is brought to you by IDEA, the Ethics Centre at the University of Leeds. To find out more about IDEA, go to ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics. Firstly, a content warning for this episode, which contains frank discussion of death and of various forms of body disposal, which some might find distressing. Sarah Carter-Walshaw, lecturer in applied and interdisciplinary ethics at IDEA, the Ethics Centre at the University of Leeds, has been thinking about the ethics of what happens to us after we die. The problem is that the current most popular methods of body disposal, cremation and burial, aren't very environmentally friendly. The good news is that other, greener methods are available. The bad news is that, so far at least, these haven't really caught on. In this conversation we discuss why not, as well as the ethical question, whether we have an obligation to consider these forms of body disposal for ourselves. So Sarah, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So we're going to talk about body disposal ethics today, which is an interesting topic for a podcast, maybe something that people won't necessarily have thought about so much, in the past, but it's an interesting area because it raises a range of different ethical issues. But I was hoping if you wouldn't mind, that you could start by just telling us a bit about body disposal ethics and what it involves, please.
Yeah, sure. So when we say body disposal, essentially we're talking about what we do with the body of someone who has passed away. So body disposal can involve burying that body, it can involve cremating it, etc. Now, I do recognise the term disposal is perhaps not the nicest way of putting it, but that is the sort of the technical term, the term that's used throughout the literature and through a lot of legislation as well. So I tend to use it for that reason. So body disposal ethics can be seen as a bit of a broad field. It's looking at the ethical issues and questions that are raised by body disposal. So that can be things like, what do we actually do with the body? How the body is actually disposed of? What is done with the remains? For example, the ethics around scattering ashes. But also things like funerary arrangements. So what goes into a funeral? What should we do around a funeral? And even then, I feel like I'm perhaps providing a bit of a limited scope. So it's quite a broad field.
Right, okay.
So in this area, personally, I'm really interested in how our moral roles, our sort of oughts and obligations balance out in this arena. So what do we do when there's a tension between the deceased and the bereaved's wants, or what broader society is willing to accept? What do we do with those situations?
Yeah, so thinking about it in terms of tensions between duties to the dead and duties to the living, you can start to see how it could become quite complex, right? Because there's a whole question about where duties to the dead come from, to what extent are kind of funeral practices about fulfilling duties to the dead, or sort of doing what the dead wants versus doing something for the living and people who were kind of close to the person who's died, and all those kinds of questions. So lots and lots to talk about, but we're going to talk about a particular element of body disposal ethics, which is environmental issues. So again, can see that as an area in which there might be tension between duties to the dead and duties to the living. So could you again set the scene a little bit with regard to the environmental concerns that are raised by the way we currently dispose of bodies?
Yeah, sure. So the two most popular ways that we tend to have, particularly in the UK, for disposing of bodies is traditional burial. So burial in the way we've been doing it for sort of the last few hundred years. You're thinking the graveyards, sort of person in a hardwood coffin, the headstone, the manicured grounds of the churchyard or graveyard. And also, of course, cremation, which is the most popular form of body disposal in the UK. Now, while they've each got things to sort of recommend them from an environmental sort of perspective, they've also got quite a few pitfalls as well. So,
so go ahead. So what are the pitfalls of those two methods?
So for traditional burial, now there's positives to this. It's going back to the earth. It feels like it's sort of quite straightforward in terms of just raw emissions. But the negatives that come up with it tend to be around, for example, resource use. So one of the biggest issues, for example, is the headstone. Very often these headstones have to be imported from either another part of the country or from further afield. So that can be quite resource intensive to get those in. If you're having a hardwood coffin, that can be quite resource intensive. Some materials will take quite a long time to grow back, essentially, depending on the type of tree. Land use is a big one. So often these areas are quite sort of heavily maintained. So nature doesn't really get much of a look in beyond, curated, manicured areas and lawns. And it's also something that can be pitched as, well, this is a space for the dead.
Yeah.
But we already have such restricted sort of space for the living. So some authors point out that the land use is less of an issue if you've got a space that's sort of shared with the community and the community can use it as a green space. But sometimes that can be sort of seen as culturally problematic to have it as an area to relax when you've got people that are trying to mourn in the same space. You've also got sort of broader issues such as contaminants from bodies as the body decays, particularly if the individual was embalmed, which is significantly less common in the UK, but does happen and is required to happen in certain circumstances. And much less common these days, but there was also, at one point at least, the possibility of contaminants from coffins getting into the soil as well. For cremation, now that seems a bit better for land use because a lot of people have their ashes scattered or just kept in the family home. But some people do have their ashes buried. So that's another example of land use. And again, might raise questions about resource use, particularly if, again, you're having a headstone of something that is not a local stone and has to be brought in. And also, there are further potential issues with cremation. So clearly, if you're getting a retort hot enough to burn a body down to the bones, that's going to use a lot of energy to power that. It's also going to release quite a lot of emissions into the air as well, just by nature of burning. So it was noted in a report by NPR that during the deadliest period of the pandemic, there were so many people who were being cremated in some areas of California that it started to basically violate local air ordinances for clean air requirements. So there's also, again, the issue of toxicity. So, for example, even if we're not talking about embalming, though that is something that can get into the atmosphere, these chemicals involved in embalming, even just down to things such as, and I'm speaking as someone whose love of sugar has gifted her a number of fillings. So amalgam fillings contain an amount of mercury, and it's believed that around 16% of the mercury in the atmosphere in the UK has come from crematoria where people who have had these fillings are being cremated.
That's an amazing stat, yeah. Yeah, my teeth are full of fillings as well, so not an element that I'd considered before, but yeah. I was doing some deep research in preparation for this conversation by having a look on Wikipedia about burial and cremation. And so as you said, cremation is the most popular form of body disposal in the UK at the moment. I think that became the case around the 60s, is that right? Sometime in the 60s? And that's after kind of almost a century of people kind of campaigning to have cremation be a more acceptable form of burial. So I think that's kind of interesting because you can imagine, so I think, back in the Victorian era, when people, say first started talking about cremation, obviously cremation as a practice of body disposal in some cultures goes back centuries, but at least as a kind of, the idea that it would be a common one in the UK starts in the Victorian era. And you can imagine that must have received quite a lot of resistance, right? The idea that we're going to start burning bodies instead of disposing them. But it did eventually, after quite a long time, catch on. And that was in response to practical concerns about land use and so on, right? So I suppose that shows that it is possible to change these practices, but potentially takes quite a long time to change people's minds about them. Yeah. So, and you've been looking at what other people have been proposing as potentially more environmentally friendly forms of body disposal. So what other options are available?
So in the UK, we do have an alternative in the form of natural burial, and we're quite good at this. We're quite sort of leading in this field. We've got lots of natural burial sites, I think more than 270 now in the UK. And there are increasing sort of pushes to see if we can introduce things such as aquamation, which is also known as green cremation or water cremation, as well as human composting. So these are things that at the minute the Law Commission is looking into and consulting on people's opinions of. But aquamation is really quite common in America. And there were some sort of moves to bring it to the UK a few years ago, but it didn't quite pan out. And for human composting, that's still a little bit in traction. It's legal in 13 states in America, but it is, again, becoming sort of increasingly popular, and more states are tabling motions to get it legalized there. And usually if something picks up speed in America, we've got at least a chance of seeing it coming over to the UK.
Yeah, okay, good. So you've highlighted 3 possible options there, so we're going to have to go into those in a bit more detail. So you said natural burial, aquamation and human composting. So maybe if we take the first one first. So natural burial, what's that and why might that be? What are the advantages and disadvantages of that?
I think so. Natural burial is a little bit like it says on the tin. So it differs from traditional burial insofar as you're not typically having a headstone, particularly not of an imported stone or anything like that. You are often buried in a burial shroud, or if you are in a coffin, it tends to be something that's quite fast growing, like wicker. And the idea here is that these spaces are not as sort of strictly manicured and as sort of tightly controlled as traditional burial spaces. So much more of the land is able to sort of be given over to nature. And for example, things like wildlife, much more encouraged to sort of be in the area, wildflowers, etc. So natural burial sites will differ from area to area in how they sort of maintain their grounds. So some, for example, will say, okay, there's no maintenance, it's just, this is the plot where your loved one is, you go on. Some will maintain paths. Some will not permit, for example, grave markers. They'll use different ways of indicating where a loved one is buried. So it will differ from site to site.
Yes.
In terms of advantages, it's everything that we sort of potentially environmentally hoped for traditional burial, but is actually sort of happening.
Right.
So, we're not worried about the resources involved in hardwood because you're using a shroud or a fast-growing wood for a coffin. You are very often not having a grave marker, or you're having, for example, a small wooden plaque. So we don't have to worry about importing marble or granite. So in those senses, it's significantly better for resource use. It's better for land use because even if you sort of were still pitching this as, that's a graveyard, I don't want to use that as a social space, nature's allowed to encroach a lot more. So you've got a lot more sort of environment for things like pollinators. Whereas if you've got sort of very strictly manicured lawns, there's much less opportunity for it to be involved in nature. So it's almost like with traditional burial, you're almost going back to nature. Natural burial, you are going back to nature.
Yeah.
But it's still not perfect, unfortunately. So there is, as I mentioned, sometimes there is still at least some maintenance undertaken. So it's not wholly given over to nature. And there's still potentially the risk of toxins. So this is another area where you might have differing approaches or policies depending on the burial site. So, for instance, if someone has been embalmed, a lot of natural burial sites will not accept them because of the toxins that will go into the soil. Some will accept them, but they won't be in the main sort of area. And they'll be in a sort of to the side sort of area where other bodies with toxins have been buried.
Yeah.
Which
It's a little toxic corner.
Yeah, which I feel raises some interesting questions about sort of ostracizing people in death, even if from an environmental perspective it does make sense that you don't necessarily want these toxins to be going into the soil. So that's quite interesting as well, and a bit potentially iffy for the environment. And finally, not so much an eco issue per se, but it's quite interesting, some research coming out of areas such as in Germany that have looked at how these spaces are managed. So the paper I'm thinking of in particular, they looked at a natural burial site where there were no grave markers. It was very much, there's a specific tree and your loved one is buried under a tree. So you know how to find your loved one because they're buried under that tree. No one else is buried under that tree. But there's nothing else to make it as sort of as natural as possible.
Yeah.
And people aren't allowed to leave gifts behind. So no sort of stuffed animals, no supermarket flowers with the wrap on, that sort of thing. And what they found were people constantly pushed back. So they would regularly leave gifts at the grave sites, which would then have to be moved by the staff, which has a risk in itself of sort of being distressing if you leave a gift and then when you return you see it's missing. Although they did try to handle that as well as they could. So, for example, you could collect the gifts from a separate area later on that had been moved. It's still quite potentially distressing.
Yeah.
And what I thought was especially important was the lack of a grave marker led to a number of mourners doing things like either painting on the tree the name of the person buried under, or carving into the tree the person that was buried under. And so depending on how these things are managed might seem to push back against what we perhaps expect or need to be able to mourn. So not necessarily an environmental issue, except perhaps maybe carving into trees is a bit of an environmental issue, but there are considerations that might indicate that some people might be unwilling to pursue an option like this,
Right.
depending on how it's managed.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. So the second option was aquamation. So what's that all about?
So aquamation, which has lots of fun and different names, water cremation, green cremation, flameless cremation, alkaline hydrolysis. Basically, it involves the use of chemicals, water and pressure to significantly speed up the rate of decomposition from months to a number of hours.
Right.
So that can be anything from between 3 to 14 hours. I think 14 tends to be more typical though.
Okay.
So what's left behind at that stage is bleached white bone, and that can be placed into a cremulator to be crushed into a powder and provide cremains, which is what happens with the sort of scorched bone following a normal cremation, flame cremation.
Didn't know that. Okay.
So you don't typically get ashes per se. You usually have got these cremains that have come from the cremulator, and it's the same thing here. It's just that it would be a very vibrant white versus the grey that you tend to see with ashes.
Right.
Or cremains.
Yeah.
So it provides these, which can then, just as with flame cremation, be given to the loved ones to scatter or to bury. But it also produces a sort of secondary substance, which is a liquid, which is sort of the result of the decomposition through this chemical process. Now, it is inert, and it can be used in fertilizing crops or can be disposed of into the wastewater system. And research has shown that this is something that's safe to do. So research in America, and there was also some research done on this in the UK as well by, I believe it was Sheffield and Middlesex universities. So as I've mentioned earlier, there was a hope that this was coming to the UK. The Co-op Funeral Care were particularly interested, but that doesn't seem to have sort of come to fruition just yet. But the Law Commission are looking into this with a bit more vigour at the moment. So in terms of its positives, it requires significantly less energy use versus cremation. So I've heard some estimates of it requires a quarter of the energy use. The toxins are dealt with as part of the aquamation process. So it tends to be considered particularly useful in agriculture, for example, when we're dealing with livestock that have, for example, foot and mouth or prions. So it basically neutralizes all of these horrible, scary things. So similarly with humans, we can see it being useful for things that are, for example, illnesses that are transmissible after death, such as Ebola, because it does just neutralize these issues and just leaves behind bleached bone and the inert liquid.
Yeah.
So as I mentioned, the liquid can be used in fertilizer, and this is common practice where aquamation is used in disposal of farm animals. And you're still left with, just sort of take the social aspect of this, you're still left with cremains. So it's not that the body is just completely gone with nothing left to mourn. So much like with cremation, you still have the ashes, whether you're wanting to inter them, scatter them, or keep them in the home. But again, it's not perfect. Large amounts of water are used in this process. So the typical body will require 1,500 litres. There are similar issues for cremains as we might see with cremation. So scattering can potentially be problematic if certain plants are smothered as a result. So that's typically why in areas of special scientific interest, you're not usually supposed to scatter ashes. It's usually banned for the risk of potentially smothering plants. And that issue remains with accremated cremains as well. And again, not so much an ecological issue, but something that might put a dampener on people's enthusiasm to go for it, is it's got a bit of an image problem, unfortunately. So there's a lot of talk around the idea of flushing loved ones down the drain, especially because this can go into the wastewater system. There's even been social media disinformation incidents in regions that do have aquamation that essentially suggest it's being put into food, very much a Soylent Green situation. And just even the way the media has approached it, I am haunted by a Telegraph heading cut that basically said, "Have a glass of Grandad."
It's not really what's being suggested, I guess, but yeah. Okay, so I can see how worry about these things as they get caught up in almost like a kind of culture war sort of dispute, right, where it becomes, there's these hippies want us to do this kind of newfangled ways of disposing of dead people, and we need to resist it. But yeah, okay, well, before we get onto the kind of more substantive ethical issues raised by these methods, let's do the last one. So you mentioned human composting. So what's that?
So human composting, you can also use its slightly less distressing connotations, or the keep with the culture war aspect of natural organic reduction, is essentially natural decomposition that is sped up through the use of natural materials. So often what's used are things like alfalfa and wood chips. So in this process, the body is also occasionally rotated. It reaches temperatures up to 55 degrees Celsius, which proponents of the technology argue suggests it can therefore be dealing with toxins as well. And you go through this process, and after so many, I would say 3 or 4 months usually, you are left with a significant amount of what is effectively soil. So there is a cremulator aspect to this as well. So bones that are not decomposed in that time go through cremulator, and the bone dust is put into the soil. But the idea is you're left with this soil that could then, for example, be used to be buried and returned to the earth in that sense, to be used for planting crops. So maybe you'd use them to plant a flower bed in the family garden, or can be used to scatter, essentially, much like you would do with cremains. So the positive in the scattering is, of course, you've still got a risk of smothering plants, but generally when you're scattering something like soil, there's chances you're going to do less harm or potential harm to the environment than when you're scattering something like ground up bone. So they're the general positives. It's also significantly lower energy use. It only needs 1/8 of the energy of traditional burial or cremation, particularly, again, if you're not intending to bring in, for example, large hardwood boxes to keep the soil in, or granite marble sort of headstones. If you're having it as just the soil, you're using it, for example, to plant a tree, then it seems to be significantly less an issue with resource use, that ability to go back to nature and so on. In terms of negatives, there are concerns around toxins. It was noted by some groups that they weren't entirely convinced by research that's been put forward by the leading company in America that provides human composting. So that's not to say that their research is inaccurate. It might very well be the case that this can destroy toxins and that the soil is safe. It's just perhaps there might be call for more peer-reviewed research into this before it's perhaps welcomed to our shores or made sort of universally legal across the States, across the UK. So another issue which I suppose is a bit of an issue for aquamation and natural burial as well, potentially, but something that comes to mind, particularly when thinking about human composting, because it's only available in a relatively small number of states in America at the minute. So we're seeing a few more case studies to illustrate this in this context, is the problem of access. So only 13 states permit it currently. Not sure if that will have changed by the time this recording goes out, because there's quite a few states that have tabled motions to look into legalising it as well. But there are people that want to have it that maybe don't live in the states. So you have a potential issue around access. So it could be that, yes, this saves a huge amount of energy, but you're having to have your body transported 2,000 miles to the nearest state that has the technology available.
Yeah.
And of course, then that soil is going to want to come back to the family home. So these huge round trips are being made, which might cancel out a big chunk of, if not all of, the energy that's being saved.
Yeah, okay. I can see that. Right, really interesting. So we've got some options there, at least, yeah, so there's kind of, in some cases, reasons to at least call for more research into whether they really are more environmentally friendly, but at least kind of prima facie, it looks like there are reasons to think that at least some of those options are likely to be more environmentally friendly than cremation or burial, or traditional burial, rather. So given that fact, it's kind of, you can see how you might think something like, we've got really good reason to opt for these kinds of options for disposal of bodies, or even it would be better if we opted for them rather than the alternatives. But the question that you're interested in is, it goes a bit farther than that, right? It's whether we actually have a moral obligation to opt for more environmentally friendly methods of body disposal. So I was interested in why you've chosen to focus on that question about obligations particularly.
So this is in part because I'm interested in how we balance our moral obligations and duties more broadly in the context of body disposal. So, for example, if following through with the wishes of the deceased would cause harm to people in the community, how do we balance the obligations we might be said to have to the deceased to fulfill their wishes, maybe, with obligations we might be said to have to the wider community? So maybe negative duties in terms of avoiding harm, even those in the community who are functionally strangers but could still be affected. So given the climate crisis, the sheer number of people that die each year, and so whose bodies will undergo body disposal of some type, this seemed like something which could certainly raise questions relating to obligations as related to body disposal in the environmental context.
Yeah.
Now, that's not to say I do away with reasons. I am very sympathetic to Darwall's view that moral reasons are moral reasons rather than other kinds of reason, because all things being equal and without there being sufficient opposing or overriding reasons on the opposite side, they are reasons that add up to a moral obligation.
Okay.
So I certainly think we have moral reason to opt for eco-friendly forms of body disposal, but I really want to see if that could be pushed further and add up to an obligation to do so.
Great. Okay. And you note that we might try to get a foothold on this idea of whether we have a moral obligation to opt for these different methods of body disposal by examining first whether we have a more general moral obligation to make environmental choices in general. So do you think we have an obligation of that kind?
So I think this similarly can be a case where there's strong moral reasons to make environmental choices in general, and in many cases these can add up to an obligation, but that's assuming that they're not outweighed or overridden by other reasons, moral or otherwise. So exploring this more general obligation led me to consider common counter-arguments to the idea that we can have a moral obligation to make eco-friendly choices in general. So those things that might prevent those moral reasons from adding up to a moral obligation. So particularly concerns that we can't have moral obligations to make eco-friendly changes because our individual acts are so minuscule in the grand scheme of things. It doesn't make sense to say that my act of driving to the shops is harmful, or that my act of recycling my bottles is helpful. So the no harm and no effect arguments. By doing this one thing, you're not harming anything. By doing this one change, you're not helping, you're not doing anything, you're not having an effect. Now, these can generally be resolved by pointing to things like aggregate harm and aggregate effects. My one instance of driving might not add up to anything, but me doing this every day alongside everyone in my village, in my town, in my county, etc., is going to add up to a harm. And similarly, me choosing to recycle might not add up to anything on its own, but it adds up when a whole entire community of populations are also doing this. So you're one individual, but you are amongst other individuals that are also doing this thing. So it's that aggregate that adds up to a harm or an effect.
Right.
So further to this, as Schwenkenbecher points out, when we choose to act in these eco-friendly ways as well, we can inspire others to do the same or to continue their own eco-friendly acts.
Yes.
So they can see they're not alone in their efforts.
Yes. So am I right in thinking Archbishop Desmond Tutu opted for aquamation, was it, for disposal of his body? So presumably, maybe one reason why he decided to do that was because he thought as a religious leader he could influence other people to take on, that kind of practice.
Yeah, that's an excellent example. So I do believe he did want to sort of put forward the idea that, well, he is an environmentally friendly, or at least friendlier, option for body disposal. And certainly the way that the media reported on aquamation, the tone definitely shifted afterwards. So it wasn't as much have a glass of grandad, flush your loved ones down the drain. It was more, oh, what is this mysterious green cremation that the Archbishop had?
Yeah.
So I believe it's Caitlin Doughty, who is an author and funeral director, who pointed out it's a lot more difficult to make these wisecracks about aquamation when you're talking about a much-loved community religious leader. So, but that's not to sort of suggest that you have to be sort of that level of influential to be able to make these changes and influence others. So the example I like to give is my mum, when she passed away, she had a wicker coffin. I'm not 100% clear on why she chose a wicker coffin, but a wicker coffin is much more environmentally friendly than a hardwood type. And So she had her wicker coffin, we dressed it in wildflowers, and quite a lot of my family members afterwards were saying, oh, well, actually, they do look really nice. Maybe I'll have that instead of the oak or what have you that I was thinking of.
Yeah.
So it feels like even these sort of smaller acts of moving towards a more eco-friendly approach are still going to influence others and are still going to mean that we are able to have more of an aggregate effect by putting these changes in place.
Yes. Yeah. So I guess, one reason why that might be valuable for people who would like to see more of these kinds of practices is that it's going to kind of generally reduce the demandingness of opting for one of these methods, because it's going to mean that there'll be less resistance, there would be less, distress and upset caused to family members and things like that. And it seems like this question of demandingness is really important in working out whether we do have a moral obligation of the kind that you're interested in. So it might potentially be quite a heavy demand on people to go against what's quite a strongly entrenched set of practices and norms around body disposal. So do you think it is very demanding to opt for one of these things at the moment?
So demandingness, when we talk about obligations for environmentally friendly choices, can be a bit different than when we're talking about sort of over-demandingness, because I know that that's already got a bit of a connotation or a specific meaning in the context of philosophy.
Yeah.
That it's more sort of centered on the idea of, oh, maybe this moral obligation makes you unable to properly flourish. Whereas demandingness in this sense can be things such as practical demandingness, and as you quite rightly point out, the potential for things like distress or other kinds of psychological harm. So to take just a general example first, if we're talking about over-demandingness, I think that tends to be one of the big kickers for whether or not something's going to add up to an obligation. So to give one example, if we talk about, for example, commuting to work. So I live in South Yorkshire, I commute up to Leeds. When I lived in Sheffield, I had access to excellent public transport, and it was very straightforward. It wasn't too taxing to just hop on the tram for 5 minutes, get the train for 40 minutes, and then you're in Leeds. So on those grounds, I felt like it made sense to say I've got a moral obligation to do this because it's not overly demanding. However, I then moved to be closer to family, and unfortunately, the area that I'm from does not believe in buses, apparently. And so it's between 3 or 4 hours at certain times to get to or from Leeds, and that could include walking through not the safest areas in darkness, in regions that also don't always power their street lamps in order to save money for the council. And I no longer feel like I have a moral obligation to commute via public transport, because it's sort of this quite stark journey or an hour by car. And it's that demandingness that, even though we're talking about practicalities, it doesn't feel unreasonable to say I had a moral obligation in Sheffield to commute this way, but not where I live now. So bringing that then to the context of body disposal, you've got these practical or potential practical barriers. So we mentioned before about you might want human composting, but the nearest centre is 2,000 miles away in a completely different state. But you've also got things like, as you've quite rightly mentioned, the distress. And this distress element doesn't seem to be quite so typical in other instances of environmental decision making.
Yeah.
Though you could argue this might be different if you've ever had to commute via Northern Rail pacer trains. But otherwise, Northern Rail aside, this does seem something that makes body disposal particularly unique in the context of trying to make environmental decisions. So that then might come down to what the public view is of the particular body disposal method, that you are considering pursuing, what was requested by the deceased. Schafer points out that there is a really fascinating tension that can happen, which essentially can lead to quite a lot of distress for those bereaved persons who perhaps find that they are in conflict due to a tension between what the deceased wanted and what the society or the local community are willing to accept, what they find appropriate. And there can also be tensions within the family. So it's not unheard of for families to be split on how to dispose of a body. And these are things that we see even before you get to things like these novel forms of body disposal, or at least novel to the UK, which might dredge up some feelings that are not particularly positive, perhaps because they've seen one too many Daily Mail headlines.
Yeah.
And so having that tension between what loved ones wanted, what communities deem acceptable, can be quite distressing, and can also sometimes come with social costs to the bereaved. So they might feel ostracised if they still pursue their loved ones' wish to have, for example, aquamation. And the community might push back on that and perhaps ostracise the person in extreme circumstances, even if only temporarily. And this is already, a difficult and vulnerable time for the bereaved. So the demandingness can be not only practical, but there's a real risk of distress, psychological harm, perhaps even social costs to the decision makers.
Yeah. Okay. So we might then have a situation where there are basically two different sets of considerations kind of pulling us in different directions, right? So there might be, on the one hand, those concerns that you've just talked about distress and conflict to the living on one side, and then environmental concerns on the other side. And those kinds of situations are always very difficult to resolve, right? Because it just looks like they're two completely different kinds of considerations. So how do you weigh them against each other? So is there a principled way of weighing those concerns against each other?
So that's a good question, and one I'm not 100% sure I can wholly answer. It's something that I'm still very much digging into. But one way that we might want to try to approach the idea as a framework to try to help us come to grips with this might be something like reaction qualifications. So reaction qualifications are the idea, essentially, we can overrule the people who get upset objection if acceding to their requests or demands would lead to or support a greater moral ill. So the common example to illustrate this is prejudiced customers. So say you've got a shop in a predominantly white area, they hire a black person to work on the shop floor. So on the new employee's first day, a number of these prejudiced customers come into the store, interact with them, they react negatively to them, and they make a complaint to the store manager that they find presence of this person distressing, and they will not return to the business until the employee is fired. So here, the greater moral ill is prejudice and racism, and it seems reasonable to say, no, we don't accede to these demands that the customers are distressed by the existence of a black person in the shop.
Yes.
So if we acceded to that, we're just feeding into this idea that it's acceptable to be racist, prejudiced, bigoted.
Yes.
So it could be argued that, if we apply this then to the context of body disposal, choosing eco options could lead to distress, but not choosing them could continue to contribute to climate change.
Yeah. So
taking the assumption that there would be no or minimal distress attached to not choosing the eco-friendly option. So the greater moral ill seems arguably to be that of climate change. However, there are further complications here. So in the case of the prejudiced customers, their distress and reaction is rooted in a morally problematic view, racism. But it's less clear that the distress relating to eco-friendly forms of body disposal will be rooted in a morally problematic view. So often these reactions and the distress that we've sort of seen related in knee-jerk reactions to things like aquamation and human composting tend to come down to people believing we need to respect the body, we need to be appropriate, and that this is not a way that we can do that. This is not compatible with this wish. And that moral view isn't in and of itself morally problematic.
Yeah.
It might be misjudged, misapplied, but it's not morally problematic in the way that the prejudiced customer's racism is.
Yes. And therefore, it's difficult to argue that you can kind of dismiss the distress of those people in the way that really you probably can dismiss the distress of the racist customers, right? Because their distress is based on their own, as you say, morally problematic view. So it just doesn't weigh very heavily. Whereas it seems like in the case of the bereaved people who have objections, their distress certainly should weigh, greater than it does in that case. Yeah.
Yeah, so I don't know how much that helps us get further because we've still got these two opposing things, but I suppose if nothing else, it helps us to identify that it's not a straight out the gate, there's a climate crisis, who cares that this will upset people? There is still moral weight that can and should be given to this distress for the bereaved persons. So it helps us in that sense, though we've still got this tension to work through. Yeah.
Great. Okay. I think we're probably going to have to leave it there, actually, but I think that's quite a good place to leave it with that kind of open question. So I'd be interested to see if any listeners have any thoughts about this, then feel free to get in touch with us by email or on social media. But I think that's raised some really interesting questions and got us at least some distance towards answering them. So Sarah Carter-Walshaw, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to Ethics Untangled, a podcast from IDEA, the Ethics Centre at the University of Leeds. IDEA brings ethics to life, blending in-depth theoretical inquiry with real-world experience to address the most complex ethical issues facing the world today. If you like the podcast, please leave us a rating and review. And to find out more about IDEA, including our Masters and PhD programmes and a wide range of consultancy services we offer, go to ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics.